It seems to me that for the last 4 years or so, my sermons have been full of phrases like, we are living in uncertain times. And it seems to me that the world has turned upside down. And how should we be living through these difficult days? Our readings are a bit apocalyptic, and they will continue to get more so as we reach the end of the church year in November. And it seems to go along with how I'm feeling about the state of the world. Every day seems to contain a year's worth of anxiety. Uncertain times. Our readings for today are rich in images and ideas for living in uncertain times, and they include how-tos and how not tos for getting through times of deep stress and distress. In Exodus, the people have watched Moses climb the mountain. At this point, they have waited 40 days and 40 nights for him to return with a message from God. But they've not seen hide nor hair of him. They are stuck in the wilderness, uncertain of where to go next, and they begin to get anxious. Is Moses coming back? Is he even alive? What are they supposed to do if he doesn't return? Yes, they have the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, but Moses is the physical manifestation of God for them. Moses follows God, and they follow Moses. What now? Aaron, seeing the people's dis-ease, helps them return to what they are familiar with from Egypt. In Egypt, the gods were made of stone and metal. If Moses isn't going to return, then they'll just make a god to lead themselves out of the wilderness. The golden calf gives the people something they can literally hold on to. The Israelites turn from worshiping the God they cannot see to worshiping a God they can see. And that is really a typical human response to stress. We all want something to hold on to when the going gets rough. The Israelites were afraid when they saw Moses go up, but not come back down. The world is afraid right now because we just don't know what's going to happen next. We are all anxious. What will happen with the pandemic? What will happen with the election? We don't know what our future will be like. We aren't sure what's going to happen tomorrow or today. We're all looking for a way to feel safe. We run the danger of turning from faith in God, the God we cannot see, and trying to find some other more tangible object to hold on to ease our anxieties and our fears. Our tendency is to return to bad habits or fall back into addictions, even when we know those things will not ease our burden. We are with the people of Israel asking the same questions they asked. What will keep us safe? Who will lead us out of this wilderness? The parable that Jesus tells in Matthew's gospel continues his explanation of the kingdom of heaven that we've read about in the last 2 weeks. There was the parable of the 2 sons 2 weeks ago, and then the parable of the wicked tenants last week. This week we read the last of the 3, the parable of the wedding feast. And just as a reminder, this parable is in response to the challenge Jesus faced from the chief priests and the elders in the synagogue. They wanted to know where he thought he got his authority. His language is harsh, with cities burned and people thrown out. The Gospel of Matthew was most likely written down after the fall of Jerusalem in 70. So perhaps Matthew had that in mind, or the writers had that burning of Jerusalem in mind when they wrote down this parable. Matthew's own readers were Jewish followers of Jesus who would have heard this parable with somewhat different ears than our own. The parable is rich in images and ideas, but I want to focus on just one aspect of this story, the clothes. What is the big deal with the wedding robe? Jesus has just said that the elite turned down the king's invitation, so that the servants went out and invited anyone who crossed their paths. The hoi polloi, the good and the bad, are invited to the feast, and many of them come. Everyone is invited into the kingdom of heaven. But apparently something is expected even of these guests off the street. They are expected to dress appropriately. There's some disagreement among scholars about who was expected to supply the wedding robe that Jesus speaks of. St. Augustine assumed that it was the king himself who supplied the robes, and the man who didn't wear one was at fault for not putting the robe on. In Augustine's thinking, the wedding feast is the great heavenly banquet that we will share with Christ one day. And the robe that we wear is our salvation, symbolized in our baptism, where we put on Christ and are made worthy. So to try to attend the wedding feast without putting on the robe is like trying to win our salvation without paying any attention to the work of Jesus. Other scholars say that it wasn't the king who supplied the robes worn, that what was expected was that people would wear their best, finest clothes, whatever that might be. For these scholars, the fact that the man does not put on his finest means he is showing disrespect to God by not living into his baptismal covenant. As if we can put on our baptism and then live however we want, and God will pay no mind. Because the man does not put on a wedding robe, whether that robe is the robe of salvation or the robe of living a Christ-like life, he is found unworthy of sharing in the banquet feast. His hubris, his assumption that he is good enough just the way he is, gets him kicked out of the kingdom. Both of these stories, the story of the golden calf and the story of the wedding feast, give us examples of how not to live in troubled times. We ought not be like the people of Israel. Our faith ought to be found in God, not in our own actions or some God of our own making. It was not the golden calf that led the people through the Red Sea onto dry ground. It was not the calf that fed them with manna or caused the water to come from a rock. It was not the calf that ultimately led them safely through the wilderness to the promised land. It was God, unseen, but present in each moment. It was God. Our salvation, our own worthiness to enter the kingdom of heaven, comes not from ourselves and the work we do, but from God. We do, as Augustine assumed, put on the robe of salvation that comes from God alone. And yet, there is some work for us to do as children of God who bear the Spirit's mark. We have a responsibility from God to live out God's love in the world, to live into our baptismal vows, to show the world what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Paul, in his own distressful situation of being in prison, writes to the church at Philippi, rejoice. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. Debbie Thomas, a lectionary blogger, writes about this passage from Paul and says that joy and peace are found through consistent spiritual practice, through prayer, supplication, gentleness, and contemplation. She goes on to say, it requires that we hold on to two realities at once, the reality of the world's brokenness in one hand, and the reality of God's love in the other. Joy is what happens when we daily live into the belief that God can and will bridge the gap between the world we long for and the world we see before our eyes. She says it is a posture, an orientation, a practice, a willingness to sit gently but persistently in the tension of the not yet, trusting that God's peace will guard our hearts and minds in that in-between place for as long as it takes. I find that so hopeful, to imagine sitting here between what we long for and what is actually going on, knowing that God will find and sustain us in the midst of it. We are God's beloved people. We need not fear our present circumstances, nor our future. We don't need to create idols, and we shouldn't sit around doing nothing but worrying. We can pray. We can be kind to everyone we meet and ourselves. We can contemplate the world as it is and the world as God dreams it. May we find our hope and joy sitting in this in-between place. And may God's Holy Spirit guard our hearts with the peace that surpasses all understanding. Amen.